But I'd like to move on to how do we know that there's overpopulation? Like, what evidence have you guys seen and been building to plot a path for where we're headed, or even where we are now, to confirm this sort of planetary diagnosis?
Yeah, we've got various forms of evidence. One of them is from the Global Footprint Network. Maybe you've heard of them, where they measure the average productivity of a hectare of farmland, grazing land, fishing grounds, forestry, acreage, and they average that over the total globe. And they look at the carbon uptake, the amount of new forest you would have to plant to absorb our carbon emissions. And they estimate we're using 1.75 Earths of renewable resources to maintain a stable planet. So that's one estimate. And they go through national accounts at quite a detailed level to arrive at that. The creator of this, Matthijs Wackernagel, acknowledges that it's most likely quite an underestimate, because this is only looking at renewable resources, not the fossil fuels, metals, and minerals that equal 95% of the weight that what at least Americans use on a daily basis, or non-renewable resources.
Right.
So it doesn't figure in that. It also doesn't figure in what you're doing in terms of topsoil erosion, the pollution of water, everything that you're doing now that will impact future productivity of those renewable resources, the pollution that you're creating that will lower that. It's hard to estimate to what extent are we eroding future capacity of creating these renewable resources. And it also doesn't leave a lot of space for large mammals. If you wanted migration corridors for elk or caribou, reindeer, it doesn't figure in that. But that's one estimate, 1.75 Earths, so a 75% overshoot of renewable resources. And that it's important to note that's based on, it doesn't matter how consumption is dealt with there, as much as we'd like to have much more equalized consumption. That's just saying our current human impact is 75% over. So no matter how we cut the pie, that's how big the pie is. And that's what it's doing relative to our renewable resources. Another good measure, the planetary boundaries that were worked out in 2009 at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And right now, I think they've got a few papers that have to be peer-reviewed, but from what I've seen, the estimates are 6 of the 9 have now been exceeded. So climate change being one, biosphere integrity, which would include biodiversity being another, land system change, as we keep moving more and more into agriculture and away from mangrove swamps and wetlands and other things that can support other species. Freshwater, in the sense we're overdrawing and polluting. Phosphorus, which we need for our crops growth, and which we're getting from phosphate rock, half of which comes from Morocco alone. And, you know, we used to have a system where we'd use animal manure, and sometimes in China and Japan, human manure, to renew our crops. Now we're using these non-renewable resources. A lot of that's going down into the dead zone, like in Louisiana, off the Gulf of Mexico there. And then another category of novel entities they've added recently, which the forever chemicals, which you might have heard of, Scotchgard and these things that stay in the environment forever, as we're finding, and plastics, the degree to which we're altering hormones and reproduction in many species. And I read recently, I haven't checked the factualness of it, but I have heard that we introduce maybe 50 chemicals, new chemicals a week into the planet. A lot of them only tested on lab rats, which is a species not in an ecosystem. It's just a mammal isolated by itself. We're not testing this on an entire ecosystem, a whole swamp, a whole mangrove swamp, a whole meadow, to see all the interactions.
You said 150 new chemicals a week?
I think it was 50 is what I had heard.
And these are just in laboratories that don't make it out into production, I suppose?
No,
and
they
they're
do make it into new products. Yeah. So
I was scared about this on this podcast, to be honest. I was scared to be more concerned than I was going in, and it's 15 minutes and we're already there.
Sorry about that.
It was kind of inevitable. Yeah.
Yeah, the more you hear about the novel entities, the petrochemical plastics and the hormone disruption, and who knows about the ecosystem impacts of that.
Right.
And Living Planet Index, you might have heard of that, the 69% decline since 1970. And they study over 30,000 populations of over 5,200 species of vertebrate species, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibian. So that's gone down by 69% on average, while the human population since 1970 has gone from about 4 billion to 8 billion. So we've more than doubled in this incredibly short amount of time.
Right.
And then you might have heard of there was a German study about insect populations have crashed in Germany, 3/4 since 1989. The extinction rate is estimated at 100 to 1,000 times higher than pre-human times. That's quite an estimate because there's so many species I think we know of 10 million species, but who knows how many bacteria, fungi, a lot of other species that we have no idea of. And the more that we're learning and the more we look, we realize how much nature is all interconnected, and the forest. I had heard even an albino redwood will get chlorophyll, will get the glucose from other redwood trees that can photosynthesize. So
I can't remember the book, but I read a book on that not too long ago.
the
talking
mother
about
tree, maybe?
No, I really had another title, but the idea was that the trees can't communicate amongst themselves to either send different resources to help them fend off attackers or to help, or so there is a communication network that happens between trees that we were previously unaware of.
Right.
And I also heard it echoed in the book, The Overstory. I'm not sure if either of you have read that.
Oh, I started it. I need to go back to that. Yeah, I didn't stay with it.
It really, I normally try to stay away from literary fiction. It's normally a little bit too dense for me, like those the Pulitzer Prize winning ones, but more than a few friends recommended it, and it's stayed in my mind for the last year and a half. Like I can't imagine seeing a forest or a tree the way that I did before reading that book. And there's a line in that book saying, like, we should never cut down a tree unless we're going to build something that is more valuable than that tree. And when looking at that, it really limits what we should be doing with trees, for example. And even talking about how a quote-unquote dead tree in a forest, people think we should just get rid of and clear it out. This is just moss or garbage, but there are like so many insects and ecosystems living within that expired tree. So there are things that, and this is part of the reason for this podcast. Like we think as humans we know so many things, and that because we know all these things, we're the supreme life on this planet. But there are just so many things the animals know, but because they don't have a podcast, we think that they don't understand the world, and the things we know are the things that we've kind of made up. Mm-hmm. Like if you're talking about law or political systems, economics or all these things are things we just made up, just like we make up a comic book or a novel, and then we claim that we're these supreme beings, whereas we're starting to destroy all the other intelligent life that we've been ignoring.